Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. Last month, there was an interesting piece in Tablet magazine called The Wages of Bitterness, which asked what went wrong with the American man by my guest today, Jacob Siegel. Jacob also has a new book out this week. It's called The Information State, Politics in the Age of Total Control. Jacob Siegel is joining us from central Israel, where he lives. Jacob, are these two pieces connected? What went wrong with the American man in this new dystopia, what you call the information state? Are they bound up with one another?
They are, though. I mean, it wasn't part of my conception in writing them that I would trace their connections. But yeah, I think unavoidably they're connected, in part because what I'm describing in the book has a lot to do with the failures of the global war on terror, and also specifically the ways in which the war on terror sort of returned home into the domestic political arena in the US and the damaging effects of that inward turn. And then I guess also there's a connection in the sense that this experience of the war on terror, which was personal for me because I was a US Army officer and I was part of it. I fought in it in Iraq and in Afghanistan, was also formative in terms of my understanding of this evolving new kind of digital society and governmental system that I call the information state, which is really this new apparatus of public-private power, sort of through the vehicle of the state, but not exactly synonymous with our understanding of what a liberal nation state is, that draws in many of these informational tools that I first became acquainted with through the war on terror, but then reapplies them to engineering the domestic political situation.
Tell me a little bit about yourself. You threw in some biographical details. You noted that you'd been in the US Army. I was looking you up before. For some reason, you're not on Wikipedia, but you're on Elon Musk's new Wikipedia rival, Grokkipedia. You sound as if you've had an interesting life. Tell me how you got involved in the US Army and how your own narrative connects with the information state, and how perhaps even you yourself, Jacob Siegel, is an example of what has gone wrong or perhaps right with the American man.
So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, had, a good life, middle-class family, very learned family. My father was an historian and a writer. But I grew up in an era and in a part of New York where things had not yet become so socially siloed. So there was still a sort of vibrant mixing of people from different classes and backgrounds in the New York that I grew up in. It hadn't yet emptied out the private sector middle class, which is something that I watched happen a little bit later in my life. But my childhood was, really New York, Brooklyn, and the sort of cultural scene in New York were the formative experiences. I went off to college.
Where did you go to college?
Boston University. I was studying history and international relations in Boston University. I had, literary pretensions. I was an unfocused student. I read a lot, but I also, all throughout high school and up until college, I was unfocused. I was a bit of a person who found myself getting into some trouble in some places and maybe couldn't always realize my potential in various ways. But
were you happy?
Andrew, you cut right to it, huh? Was I happy? I probably not. I don't think I don't think I was particularly happy. I wasn't acutely unhappy either, but I was unsatisfied. I had a restlessness and a sense that I had something to prove, and also that there was something incomplete about my experiences up till that point when I was, let's say, 2021. Which leads us up to September 11th, 2001. I was in college at the time. Almost immediately after the attacks, I returned back to New York. I was volunteering at Ground Zero. I spent a few weeks in New York volunteering, and then very quickly, once the US started to get on a war footing, it wasn't that I had any strong ideological conviction that the war was right or wrong or any particular sense of the politics of it at the time. What I had was an overwhelming sense that if America was going to war, I should be a part of it, that I was an American, that this was my duty, and
You were
also
an
that
American man, of course, to add
uh,
to bring
very much so, very much
the
so.
Wages of Bitterness piece. The American man. I wouldn't say the American man goes to war, but the American man stands up for the American nation, right?
Yes, I was an American man with a sense of myself as an American man. You know, there's a great memoir by a former New York Times literary critic, Anatole Broyard, called "When Kafka Was the Rage," which is this memoir about his experiences as a literary man in Greenwich Village after returning from World War II. It's just a beautifully written, very very poignant, kind of sensual memoir of those years in Greenwich Village and of the intellectual and literary ferment of the time.
Is there a
And
kind of do you think of yourself in Rothian terms? The more I look and listen to you, there's a Nathan Zuckerman quality perhaps to your life.
no, no, not at all. No, more in Broyard terms, if anything, actually. But what Broyard says in that book is that he's talking about being surrounded by these fellow Greenwich Village intellectuals at the time, people like Delmore Schwartz and this sort of very vibrant New York intellectual scene in the post war years. And he says that they were all estranged from America, and that it was a very central part of the post war experience to feel one's estrangement from America, and that he did not feel estranged. He felt estranged, if anything, from their estrangement. And Broyard had a fascinating backstory that I won't fully get into here, but I related to that. I did not
Broyard,
feel.
I'm not too familiar, but I know you wrote an interesting piece for Unheard, again, a spin-off of your new book on disinformation called The Great Disinformation Hoax, where you write about the 50s and Senator Joseph McCarthy. What was his take on the Red Scare and that narrative, and how did that connect perhaps to your broader narrative of being an American male?
So that piece was actually for Tablet. The Unheard thing, I think, was just an interview I did with him. That was a guide to understanding the hoax of the century. 13 Ways of Looking at Disinformation was the original Tablet piece that my new book, The Information State, is based on. McCarthy led created a kind of atmosphere of pervasive paranoia within the American political system that was attached in a direct way to something that was real, which is that there were real ongoing attempts by the Soviet Union to implant, active agents within the U.S. government. There were active measures. There was active efforts at subversion. We know this from Whittaker Chambers, Alger Hiss, so on and so forth. That there were real active communist agents within the U.S. government. This was not just some kind of right-wing fever dream or McCarthyite fever dream. But McCarthy took that real threat and inflated it into a kind of all-encompassing, pervasive paranoia in a way that I think was damaging. As far as how that relates to American manhood, I think the American male character from the 1950s has these like larger than life embodiments in Don Draper and this sort of Mad Men character. But those post-war years, which are now very much identified with the Red Scare and with McCarthyism, were unbelievably fertile, active years in American life. There were a lot of different versions of American manhood. This is when Jack Kerouac was writing. It's, you know, was also the explosion of the American suburbs. The baby boom was sort of, you know, expanding out from the cities into the suburbs. So it's a very fertile period.
Yeah, and to go back, I know you're not maybe quite so keen on equating yourself with Nathan Zuckerman, but this was also the moment, of course, for Philip Roth and his notion of a male American man, American Jewish men. But anyway, go on.
Yeah, no, I think The Counter Life is the Roth novel that speaks to me. I think Roth's a brilliant writer, and I think The Counter Life is one of the great novels of the 20th century. But Roth was not a formative influence on me. He wasn't somebody I identified with. And, you know, I think the first few things I read by Roth, actually, I didn't really relate to. But that character of like the, you know, New York City area Jewish intellectual who's also very much deeply embedded in the American scene of the moment, that certainly was something I related to.
Okay, so let's and I apologize for leading us on these side streets, but let's go back to the main story of the information state. So you're not particularly happy, or you're dissatisfied perhaps with your life at Boston University. The planes hit on 9/11 and you join up. Tell me a little bit more about what that experience was like and how it led to this argument you make in the information state about politics in the age of total control. I'm not sure who has the total control.
Sure. Yeah, it's an effort at total control. So it's the dream of total control that no one ever fully realizes, but that's the sort of guiding aspiration of the political technological system we live inside. As far as myself, I enlisted in the Army, you know, within a few months after 9/11. In 2006, I deployed to Iraq. I was in Iraq for close to 15 months. It was a long, difficult deployment. I was with a few different units over that time. And it was a searing experience that I had to spend a number of years just trying to sort out on a personal basis when I got back from Iraq. It didn't really, it didn't go directly into this book, The Information State. But a few years after getting back from Iraq, I deployed to Afghanistan, my second deployment in 2012. And when I was in Afghanistan, I had this experience where I was an intelligence officer for an infantry battalion. So I was really sort of in the heart of it. And I had these unbelievably powerful technologies of surveillance, of informational analysis and prediction, various kinds of sensors, databases at my fingertips. And yet in 2012, when I was in Afghanistan, I could not get a straight answer about what we were trying to accomplish in Afghanistan and how this related directly to America's national interests, or whether it was even achievable. So my own unit, we were involved in training the Afghan security forces. But the thing we were trying to transform the Afghan security forces into, which was a sort of like a penny ante version of the American army, essentially, you know, a much lower level version built on the same essential model, was clearly something that was not working. And that the Afghans in the area who we were trying to train to emulate this model were not really interested in part because where I was in Western Afghanistan, there was not a lot of feeling of direct connection to the government in Kabul. There wasn't much of a feeling of a unified national identity that everyone was participating in, so that if you were in Herat or Kandahar or Paktika province in the east, you all felt a common identity. It simply didn't exist. And yet at the same time, so there was this incoherence on the ground. There was this essentially stumbling war effort on the ground that had already been going on for a decade by the time I got there. And yet at the same time, at a level above what was happening on the ground, there were these extraordinarily powerful instruments of what appeared to be informational mastery over the whole country. So from a single tactical operations center, we had drones in the sky, we had various kinds of sensors, we had human intelligence sources. All of these were feeding into these centralized databases. Those centralized databases could be queried in the same way that you and I would query Google today. They also fed into these predictive analysis models like Palantir and various things like this that were supposed to tell us where the war was heading next. And so there was this extraordinary disjunction between the power of these tools that I had at my fingertips and the kind of stumbling incoherence of the war effort itself. And when I got back to America, I had been thinking about this. I was trying to make sense of it. And then within a few years, those same tools that I had not only seen, but that I had directly used in Afghanistan started to show up in America as instruments of domestic politics, as ways of surveilling American citizens.
So this is your politics in the age of total control. Jacob, as you know, there are many books on this subject. Most of them are written from the left. Most of them, we did the original. In fact, I blurbed Our Age of Surveillance Capitalism, many books about how Silicon Valley now is watching over us, but they're mostly written from the left. Yours, perhaps, is a little more complicated. You're writing not so much about Trump, but in some ways about Obama. You note that you were in Afghanistan in 2012 when Obama was president. Would it be fair to argue that your book is not the conventional leftist sort of Orwellian critique of politics in the age of total digital control? It's more nuanced, perhaps more conservative?
Yeah, that's certainly fair. I don't know that conservatives would like to label me that way necessarily, but certainly it's not the standard leftist account, in part because, one of the things that I'm showing in this book is that the technocratic information state that I'm describing is itself built out of a progressive political ideal. So the premise that society can be rationalized and organized through information technologies so that this chaotic thing, public opinion, can be disciplined and brought and harnessed to proper social ends is a progressive political ideal. So the Obama administration, the reason why I spend so much time on them is because that is the administration that elevates these incipient technologies of surveillance and of informational control into a kind of art of government and politics. And they do this successfully in part because they attach a very attractive progressive political gloss to it. They don't do it as Orwellian censors. They don't do it as, sort of reactionary right-wing authoritarians. The way that this mass surveillance system gets built out into a totalizing digital system is in part through the idea that in doing so, we'll be able to bring people the correct progressive social ideals about race and about gender, and we'll be able to harmonize this large and otherwise disorganized American society so that we can get important things done. That's part of what makes the Obama information state era so crucial.
Yeah, I take the argument. Your review in Publishers Weekly suggested that they described it as a hit or miss debut, they weren't totally convinced. Can you give me, I mean, this sounds good, I guess, and certainly right-wing media, maybe your readers at Tablet or Free Press might appreciate it, but give me some examples. I was around in the teens during the 8 years of the Obama regime, and I never felt as if there was any politics in the age of total control. I felt quite free to say and do what I wanted. What exactly, could you give me some examples, Jacob, of how this actually impacted on people?
Yeah, certainly. You might not have been saying anything that was threatening to the
Actually,
Obama
I was.
administration.
You know, I was probably the most
It
prominent.
depends. I don't know. I didn't follow all of your statements at the time, but it's possible that what you were saying wasn't something that they thought of as threatening, but they did prosecute.
You just said that. Let me just come back here at that.
Sure.
Back then, I was one of the most prominent and controversial critics of big tech and of the very information state that you describe. Very critical of the big tech companies that you wrote about in the book. So I was someone who had a great deal of visibility. But anyway, go on.
Okay. I don't know the history of your positions in those years, but I do know that the Obama administration prosecuted more journalists than any other presidential administration over the previous century. And I know that the Obama administration's approach to handling public opinion was through something that Obama's very close advisor, Ben Rhodes, described as the echo chamber, which was a way of organizing a kind of new astroturfed consensus of various kinds of experts, media figures, into what would appear to be an organic consensus around a political issue. This is something that Rhodes talked about, that he was quoted at length about in an interview that he did, a profile written of him, by the journalist David Samuels. So the effort to control public opinion, which is a central plank of what I'm describing as the information state, is not, I mean, this was not something happening surreptitiously that you couldn't see unless you were examining obscure phenomenon. It's right there in the prosecution.
Right. I mean, I take your point. Actually, David Samuels has been on the show, but it's one thing, and Ben Rhodes has been on the show too, but it's one thing to try to shape public opinion. It's quite another to put journalists in jail. You said that Obama
they did both. They did both.
But let's talk more concretely. Could you give me some examples of journalists that the Obama regime put in jail?
Yes, certainly. Give me 1 second. I want to just...
Because none come to mind, to me at least, certainly compared to what's happening now in the U.S.
I said put in jail, or I don't know if I said put in jail.
Well, but you need to be more concrete in terms of what they did.
Okay, I'd be happy to do that. So there was a journalist who worked for Fox News, for instance. I want to get the name right, so you'll have to give me a moment, and I'll pull it up. It's Jason Rosen, I believe was his name. But the fact that there were more prosecutions of journalists under the Obama administration is not a matter of debate. It's a matter of public record. Give me one moment here. I'm going to quote from the information state. 6 government employees plus 2 contractors, including Edward Snowden, were subjected to felony criminal prosecutions based on the 1917 Espionage Act under the Obama administration, more than double the number carried out under all previous administrations combined over the previous century. In 2013, the Obama Justice Department investigated a leak by obtaining the records of 20 phone lines in the offices of the Associated Press, as well as the home and cell phone records of AP reporters. The AP itself was not even the target of the investigation. Yada, yada. Separately, reporters' phone logs and emails were secretly subpoenaed. And here's the Fox News reporter who I mentioned, who was accused in an affidavit of being an aider, abettor, and/or conspirator of an indicted leak defendant and exposing him to possible prosecution for doing his job as a journalist. Another Fox News reporter James Rosen had his travel activity phone records and personal emails monitored in a different investigation of a suspected leak. And there's also James Risen from the New York Times. So there was an active.
Risen's been on the show. There are a couple of thoughts I have on this, Jacob. Firstly, are you defending Snowden? I mean, Snowden was a traitor, wasn't he? I mean, they had every right to pursue him. He gave away state secrets. So, I mean, we can't blame Obama for that, or politics in the age of total control. Whether Snowden existed in Bush 1 or 2 or Clinton or Obama or Biden or Trump, all these administrations are going to go after a guy like that, aren't they? And he wasn't anyway. I mean, Snowden was a military contractor. He wasn't a journalist.
Yeah, that was in reference. I brought up Snowden in reference to prosecutions under the Espionage Act, but you're absolutely right. Snowden absolutely would have been prosecuted by any administration. So taking Snowden out of it, however, granting your point that Snowden doesn't indicate the age of total control or any kind of exceptional political agenda under the Obama administration, the larger pattern that I described and that I cited in the rest of that quote holds. There was a pattern of prosecution of journalists, I think much of it motivated politically, and that prosecution of journalists took place within a larger political environment that prioritized the shaping of the information environment and the shaping of public opinion in ways that may have been an extension of past attempts at shaping public opinion, which I detail in the book. I don't suggest that Obama invented these things out of whole cloth. The whole point of the book is I'm telling a story that starts as early as the 17th century and really gets going in America with the Wilson administration. But I think the Obama administration brought this to a new level in part by utilizing tools of the war on terror that had been really expanded under the Bush administration, and then were harnessed for domestic political ends by Obama. And, if Snowden is taken out of this entirely, the rest of that pattern still holds. Let me make one other point, because I think there's a bit of a category confusion that's going on here. When I describe politics in the age of total control, again, I'm not saying that the American political system ever arrived at a perfected form of totalitarian politics. I'm describing an ambition that's intrinsic both in the informational systems that are being deployed and in an evolving form of government and political ideology. But there's a constant back and forth that I'm trying to trace in the book between the creation of these totalizing information systems and political systems and the revolt from an uncooperative public. That's really the story of the book. It's not about the perfection of this state of total control, or the suggestion that the US is a prison state on the, like North Korea or something like that. It's really about this back and forth, this tension between the aspiration towards a kind of total control and the unwillingness, the unruliness of the public and its unwillingness to go along with that, and where that tension leads.
I have to ask this question. I mean, because I'm sure all my audience will want me to ask it. Jacob, your book is mostly a sort of a narrative about this history, this development of the information state, but you noted its origins perhaps in the Obama administration, or the record number of attempts by the administration to go after journalists. How does it compare with the Trump years, Trump 1 or particularly 2, the years we're living in now? My guess, I haven't written the book, so I'm not, I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but my guess is that the Trump administration has gone after far more journalists than the Obama administration. What's your sense? Have you researched this?
No, I think you're wrong. But if you
you mentioned 6. I mean, I can think of 6 probably.
I mentioned 6 prosecutions related to the 1917 Espionage Act under the, so that's specifically about the Espionage Act.
And that was a Wilson era.
Correct. The book is not a defense of the Trump administration.
No, and I appreciate that. And I don't want to always because we always drag Trump into everything. But I'm just curious as to your sense. So you think the Obama?
I think the Trump administration's relationship to the press is toxic and dysfunctional, and that there's an effort to be there's a kind of like overt authoritarian tendency to some of it. I don't think that that's a controversial thing to say. What's the crucial difference between the Trump administration and the Obama administration in particular in reference to what I am describing, which is a technocratic form of state control that crosses over from the federal government apparatus into the NGO sector and into the private technology sector? That's what I mean when I'm describing the information state as a new form of government, a new kind of political dispensation. In the Trump administration, there is a much more overt center of power that doesn't involve this kind of sprawling, opaque network of auxiliary NGOs and fact-checking bodies that get embedded in media organizations, et cetera, which was the case under the Obama administration and continued in the Biden administration, and was what made the information state distinctive in that era. The quality of the informational control in the Trump era is more direct. It has to do with the Trump administration's relationship and with Trump's personal relationship with a handful of very powerful figures in the tech world, Elon Musk most notably, but also people like David Sachs, and with Alex Karp and Palantir, and with the effort to use the tools of AI in particular as a way to advance the administration's agenda unilaterally. So there's a difference in kind between this sprawling technocratic system that bases its legitimacy on an idea of hyper-rationality and progressive government, which was what the Obama administration perfected, and the much more overt, direct, sort of quasi-monarchical authority of the Trump administration. You can certainly make the argument that the Trump administration has done any number of bad and illegitimate things, but that's the part of it that's germane to the argument that I'm making here.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair response. There seems to be in your information state, Jacob, a kind of a Gramscian quality. I'm not sure if you've read Antonio Gramsci.
I'm familiar with Gramsci.
The Italian Marxist theorist of kind of cultural hegemony. Is this what you're arguing, that it wasn't just Obama, it was all the NGOs, it was at that point at least Silicon Valley, which was considered on the left rather than now on the right? Yes, a couple of days ago we did a show about how Silicon Valley now is supporting Trump. But are you suggesting that this is a kind of, if not a Gramscian plot, because Gramsci didn't write about plots, it wasn't sort of Leninist, there's some sort of almost like an unspoken arrangement where you talk about this sprawling technocratic system was created by a sprawling technocratic elite, the Ben Rhodes of the world, the Obamas of the world, the people who ran Google, the people in Washington, D.C. and New York and San Francisco who run all the nonprofits. Is that the core argument here? A kind of, maybe not even Gramsci, kind of Kafkaesque control of everything that is so overt and daring that we don't even notice it. We wake up one morning and we're the bug.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Kafkaesque, this, Andrew, you there?
Yeah, go on. That was Kafka interfering.
Yeah, clearly. The Kafkaesque quality is that the system is both totalizing and yet ineffective and inefficient. This is the real horror, right? That you come up with this superhuman power, superhuman technology that's supposed to, excuse me, rationalize the entire world. And it ends up not being able to do fairly straightforward things very well.
Kind of like what the US got up to in Iraq and Afghanistan. You got all this sophisticated technology,
Exactly.
and you can't even control relatively undeveloped societies.
Exactly. And
So
that's a story that goes
I
back
have
to
to jump
Vietnam.
in here then, Jacob. Why write about it if it's so ineffective?
Well, that's like saying why write about Iraq and Afghanistan or Vietnam for that matter, isn't it? I mean, they can still be historically significant. The phenomenon is still historically significant, even if it doesn't achieve what it aims to achieve. And I think this phenomenon is historic. Look, part of what makes this phenomenon so historically significant is that its power grows despite its continuous record of failing to achieve its own purported ends. What can we draw from that? What conclusion do you draw if you see a system that continues to grow more powerful despite failing at the things it says it's going to accomplish? What I draw from it, in part, is that the system itself begins to assign its own values to the humans around it. So the technological system becomes not totally self-determining, but self-determining to some significant extent, whereby even if it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, it continues to be rewarded. It continues to grow larger. The Gramscian aspect of this, if there is one, I think, is that it's a class. I'm describing the growth of a class with its own particular interests. That there's a sociological phenomenon. You know, I
It's a
don't use
dominant class. You said this is a dominant technocratic class of
right, and
of
I don't use the term deep state. I think that it's clouded by too many sort of murky connotations. But there's a sociological phenomenon here. There's a class, which is in America in particular, you've had the consolidation of a single national ruling class over most of the 20th century, much of the 20th century. And this single national ruling class, which increasingly they all attend the same universities, they all pass through the same credentialing
didn't go to
institutions.
Boston University, did they?
Some of them might have. There might be some people who went to Boston University, but eventually there's a sort of convergence of
Right.
a sort of hegemony of cultural tastes, of attitudes, of presumptions about the world. This is distinct from what had preceded it, which was a network of local elites whose power was then negotiated through tensions in a national system. Right, that's the preceding system that you might say reached its apotheosis under FDR's New Deal, where there are these competing interests, and then there's a single national government that sort of reconciles those competing interests, which represent these different local constituencies. So you've had the radical flattening of local difference, the consolidation of a single national ruling class. That's the sociological phenomenon. That then intersects with the technological phenomenon I'm describing, which is a global communications infrastructure, which from its inception is aimed at the control of public opinion and human behavior. So once you have this single national ruling class with a kind of technocratic ideology, which is present in progressivism going back to the 19th century, and this then converges with a global communications and surveillance network, which is the internet, that's where you get the information state. But there's not a total rupture between liberal democracy and the information state. We're living in a period where they're overlapping.
So your argument is that Silicon Valley is actually in the sprawling technocratic system, that they're on the other side. I mean, we've had so many arguments about how Andreessen and Thiel and the Palantir guys and Musk, of course, they're all in the Trump camp. But you're arguing the reverse, certainly under Obama.
Well, Andreessen was for Obama before he was for Trump. So, I mean, Andreessen himself is a sort of illustration of how Silicon Valley has shifted. Andreessen was one of the early prominent Silicon Valley backers of Obama in 2008. Obama ran as the candidate of Silicon Valley in 2008. He came to Google headquarters to deliver his speech, Palo Alto was a huge source of funding for his campaign, and he very effectively brought the culture of Silicon Valley into harmony with the culture of progressive Washington, D.C., Obama era Washington, D.C. You mentioned surveillance capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff's book. I think Zuboff does a very good job of detailing, documenting how under the Bush administration, there was this condition of surveillance exceptionalism, as she describes it, whereby there was an extraordinary growth in the power of companies like Google and Facebook to do mass surveillance through a kind of carve out created for them by the Bush government, which wanted to increase the power of private social media companies to do essentially mass surveillance on a for-profit basis, because it recognized that this augmented the power of the security state. But Bush did that as a cultural outsider. He never jived with Silicon Valley. Obama inherited that system and then brought the culture together. And this is well documented as early as
Yeah, and I mean
2008.
Eric Schmidt, I think, who was at the time the CEO of Google, I think he visited the Obama White
Gave a
House
campaign
more.
speech. Right.
Well,
Sorry.
I think Schmidt visited the Obama White House more than anyone else outside the
Right.
Obama family. But Jacob, given what's happened since Obama, does this even, again, I take your point, and probably in broad terms, there's something in it, in your theory of the information state. But given what's happened since, given that Silicon Valley has shifted entirely, or seems at least from many people's positions, shifted entirely away from this to the Trump White House, they all showed up for his latest inauguration. Does it suggest that none of this really mattered? I mean, how does it fit in to the current American situation?
Well, I don't think that's true at all, that the Silicon Valley has shifted entirely to Trump. I think the vast majority of Silicon Valley remains, essentially anti-Trump, would rather see a Democratic president, but Trump captured or co-opted a very significant, very influential kind of counter elite. But most of Silicon Valley then responds to the signals. So Zuckerberg sees that Trump is coming into office, or that there's a backlash against the Biden administration, and Zuckerberg begins to speak out openly about regretting his participation in fiascos like the Hunter Biden affair, censorship of the reporting on the Hunter Biden laptops. That doesn't. So in other words, like, political winds shift. I don't think that it means there's a more elemental shift in the political makeup of Silicon Valley, or that it's mostly pro-Trump now. I think that the infrastructure of the information state is the internet itself. It's not the ideology grafted onto this structure by the Obama administration or the Trump administration. The basic conditions of digital society are what produce the information state. And as far as the Trump administration changing the basic conditions of digital society, they're very, very minor. So I think that what we're seeing now is that we have a new kind of digital society, which naturally spawns a new form of government, in the same way that private property relations spawned a particular form of government, feudal relations spawned a particular form of government, digital relations spawn a particular form of government. This goes back and forth between left and right wing manifestations. The Trump manifestation carried out a pretty effective early campaign to eliminate some of the more onerous mass censorship and speech restrictions which had been imposed over the previous decade. I think that was a good step. I still don't think that solves the fundamental problem of how we mediate social relations on the internet or on social media companies like Twitter. Look, I think that Twitter under Elon Musk is like a horrifying factory of schizophrenia and just general social dissolution. I don't think that the Musk model of Twitter suggests that there's been some great victory won. And nor do I think that the Musk model of Twitter was the inevitable direction that it had to take after essentially being disconnected from the kind of covert forms of government control that had been going on under the Biden administration.
Well, Jacob, let's end where we began with your Wages of Bitterness essay, What's Wrong with the American Man? Some people might read the subtitle Politics of your new book, The Information State, Politics in the Age of Total Control, by connecting it perhaps with your own narrative and suggesting that there is a gendered quality here, that the crisis of the American man, and we have books about it, we've done shows with Richard Reeves, all this sense of powerlessness of the American man. They're not quite where they were perhaps in the age of Joseph McCarthy. Is there something in that? Could one argue that this dystopia that you're introducing, Politics in the Age of Total Control, is actually a kind of male nostalgia, that total control is something that we shouldn't be, that sort of simply recognizes the new reality, which also explains the crisis of the American male?
Yeah, someone can argue that.
But you wouldn't.
Am I nostalgic for Joseph McCarthy as a...
No, I didn't suggest you personally, but I'm suggesting that this, and you're not alone. I mean, there are so many pieces, so many books and articles about our new politics in the age of quote unquote total control, whether it's Google or Trump or Obama or this sprawling technocratic elite. And it's all part maybe of men not being particularly comfortable with the new controls. I mean, we could have a whole show about Me Too and all these other movements. Is there a connection between the crisis of the American male and this sense, at least, of total control of the internet, of our digital world?
Well, I think that the digital world has quite dramatically reduced the power of human decision-making and human agency, and has relocated it into systems that make that agency and decision-making harder to trace, more opaque, and that there's been a diminution of the human subject, the human as a subject has been diminished in the technological age. I'm a man, so I write from the perspective of being a man. And I think that there is a particularly male dimension of that. I also think that there's a dimension of that that's particular to women and that could be written from that perspective as well. But beyond that, there's also simply the phenomenon that we've witnessed recurrently throughout history, whereby great technological changes reorder social relations in ways that then give rise to new economic systems, which give rise to new political systems and ideologies that go along with those political systems. Digital society is a transformation that seems to me to be on the order of the printing press. And it makes sense in historical terms that the industrial era social and political relations that many of us grew up inside of, and that some of us are nostalgic for, are not going to be able to persist in those historical forms under digital conditions. My book is an effort to grapple with that and to explain how a first draft of the new political reality was the information state, which grew out of the war on terror.
Well, there you have it. The book is out this week. The Information State by Jacob Siegel, our guest. Politics in the Age of Total Control. We are in an age of total control. I thought that was a very free-ranging conversation. No one censored what either Jacob or I said. Jacob, congratulations on the book. We'll have to get you back on. Lots more to discuss. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.